From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana. From this...
I believe that we have a moral duty. We will be ending our contribution to climate change by 2050 and legislating for a net zero emissions target.
Green is good. Green is right.
To this.
Net zero by 2050 is impossible. I want a better future and a better environment for our children, but we have to get real.
And it's not just the Conservative Party that's been on a journey. New polling for The Times shows that more and more people in Britain are questioning whether climate change has been exaggerated. Despite all the headlines and our own experience of freakish weather.
2025 is officially the hottest summer on record.
The Scottish Fire and Rescue Service has issued several wildfire warnings this year.
The Met Office said this summer's weather was made 70 times more likely by climate change.
The evidence is piling up. Climate change is already here. Scientists say lowering our emissions to net zero by 2050 is the only way to limit global warming to 2%, a level that would avoid the very worst effects. But among the public, even those who do believe that climate change is a problem, there's a growing reluctance to do anything about it.
I think there's bigger issues right now. There's people starving today. It's probably worth spending money on that than something that might kill you 100, 200, 300 years later.
The story today: has the public stopped caring about climate?
I'm Oliver Wright, policy editor at The Times.
Oliver, take us back to 2021. You and The Times decided to embark on a project. Just tell us a bit about it.
Yeah, if you go back to 2021, Britain was due to hold the COP26 climate change conference, and we thought it would be really interesting to test the views of the public about what they thought about climate change. How aware were they of the target that Britain had set itself? What were they prepared to do to meet that target? And was there skepticism about whether the whole thing was sensible or not, or was it something that people were enthused about? So we teamed up with YouGov, who do all the polling for The Times, and the opinion consultancy Public First, who conduct focus groups, to try and get a sort of picture, particularly of what swing voters felt. In terms of the polling, you speak to just over 2,000 people designed to represent the country as a whole. And in terms of the focus groups, we wanted two sort of different types of demographic, as it were. We wanted people in the southeast, so we went to Watford and spoke to people in Watford. And then we wanted people in a different part of the country, so we went to the West Midlands. Now, clearly, two groups of people are never going to be representative of the views of everyone in the country. But what you really want to do is just have a chat with people to see what they're interested in, what they've heard, what they think is important, because it puts sort of flesh on the bones of the polling. It gives you an idea of what people are thinking themselves rather than just sort of asking them questions specifically.
Was there a lot of awareness about COP26? Thinking back to that moment, I suppose, in the headlines, you had people like Greta Thunberg banging the drum for taking on climate change.
It was everywhere. I mean, listeners will probably remember it. Britain hosting COP in Glasgow was a big deal. Every single cabinet minister went up there. It led the headlines.
Your Royal Highnesses, Your Excellencies, Lords, Ladies and Gentlemen, welcome to the opening ceremony for the World Leaders Summit of COP26.
So you've had thousands of delegates, many protesters.
This is no longer a climate conference. This is now a 2-week-long celebration of business as usual and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, it was a big deal. It felt like this was the point where Britain was actually positioning itself within the world as a sort of climate leader.
If we don't get serious about climate change today, it will be too late for our children to do so tomorrow.
Boris Johnson was extremely keen. This was an area where really Britain could lead the world.
We can phase out the use of cars with hydrocarbon internal combustion engines. By 2035, we can do that. We in the UK are leading by ending new sales by 2030. We can end the use of coal-fired power stations. We can do it. By 2040, we have the opportunity and we have the duty.
Boris Johnson was very gung-ho about trying to take on the climate challenge. Where were the public? Did they agree with him?
What we found back then was the public did agree with him in the sense that they felt that climate change was a pressing problem, and it was a problem that they felt needed to be tackled. Now, where they were a little bit more skeptical was about the changes to their lives that they would have to make to do it. It wasn't open antipathy, but there was a sort of, well, we'd all love to have an electric car if we could afford it, but we don't really know if we can afford it. Yes, we're not particularly attached to our gas boiler, but what's going to come next? But there was a willingness to change, I think, back then.
You sort of said that people were quite supportive of the idea of doing something about climate change, but less sure about the policy areas. What were the conclusions that surprised you?
So I was surprised, and perhaps I shouldn't have been, by how little understanding there was of what net zero was. Because, if you live in, like I do, in the Westminster bubble, you sort of know implicitly what it means, and you kind of think, oh, everyone else must be aware of it. But we asked them, had they heard of net zero, and what did they think it meant? And in those days, all these focus groups, because it was the aftermath of COVID, had to be done on Zoom. And I could just remember sitting there looking at the Zoom screen with these sort of 12 blank faces staring back at me. Now, that having been said, they did know about what the government more broadly was trying to do on climate change, that they were trying to reduce emissions. They were aware of the push for electric cars. They were even aware of this idea that you maybe ought to eat less meat because cows producing methane is one of the drivers of emissions. But in terms of the sort of net zero itself, the thing that surprised me was how little recognition of that specific target there was.
And Oliver, I've got to ask, because I know we're a few years on, but I'm not sure that's necessarily changed for people outside the Westminster bubble. So go on, give us your best definition, a quick guide to what is net zero.
Yeah, I mean, many people don't know what it is, even though it's now more than 6 years since the government came up with that target. Effectively, what net zero is a legally binding target set by Theresa May in 2019 in one of her last acts as Prime Minister, which commits the UK basically to not emit any carbon dioxide in anything that it does by 2050. Now, this is in itself quite tricky because there are things like flights which are really difficult to decarbonise, and that's where the net in the net zero comes in. So what it's basically saying is the UK won't emit any carbon dioxide into the atmosphere apart from carbon dioxide which is then stored or taken away from the atmosphere in other ways, i.e. if, for example, you can't get rid of all the carbon dioxide that comes from planes, you will take carbon dioxide from the atmosphere in other ways and store it under the ground in what's known as carbon capture and storage. So that's the net bit of net zero.
So overall, Britain isn't emitting any carbon.
Then you talked about some of the policies that, people were aware of that would help with that, controlling emissions, changing your gas boiler. Did you find people were willing to adapt? Were they willing to pay for it?
Yeah, I mean, they were willing to adapt, and up to a point, they were willing to pay for it. The overarching theme was, we'd love to do this stuff. We think it's the right thing to do, but we don't have that much money, and how are we going to be able to do it?
I mean, I was quite surprised by some of the statistics. You had 60% of people saying they were willing to pay more for flights, for example, back then, if it meant helping the environment. That's quite a high figure in terms of people willing to give up a bit more.
Yeah, no, it was. I wonder whether part of that was that people hadn't travelled much over COVID, so it was less of a thing then. And I thought the fact that, pretty much a quarter of people were prepared to have new taxes on gas bills to encourage people to switch to electricity. Now, 25% isn't still very much, but it's still a quarter of people, which is quite interesting. So while you didn't have a majority, there was still a sort of a sizable minority that were prepared to pay more.
You've done another big poll a few years on. You've been around the country again doing these focus groups. Where did you do them this time?
We couldn't do exactly the same town in the West Midlands, but we did Watford again, and we did a very similar area in the West Midlands to that we did last time. And we also used YouGov, and we repeated the questions which we asked people the previous time. I thought, particularly with climate change, you'd had the war in Ukraine, the cost of living crisis, a change in government. An awful lot has changed in quite a short period of time. And has that had any bearing on people's views on climate? Is it much the same as it was in 2021, or has it changed? It was a speculative exercise at that point.
And what did you find?
I think the most startling thing to me was the way in which people were really questioning the whole basis of why we were taking this action in the first place to combat climate change. I thought, maybe naively, that this was a debate that had been pretty much put to bed. But what we found was that in this polling, 1 in 4 Britons now believe that the threat of global warming had been exaggerated. Now, go back again for a minute to our polling from 2021 when we asked exactly the same question. And we find that that figure has risen by over 50% in 4 years, which is a pretty startling finding. Equally, 20% of the public don't believe that climate change is the result of human activity. People are prepared to pay less for the transition to net zero than they were 4 years ago, even from a low base. Just a couple of examples. Just 6% now are prepared to see their gas and electricity bills rise, down from 11%. Just 26% are prepared to see the price of petrol go up, down from 36%, and just 48% prepared to pay a levy on flights, down from 57%. Now, some people might say, actually, 48% people prepared to pay a levy on flights isn't bad. But across all those areas, you have seen a decline in support for measures that might reduce emissions. One of the interesting things when we did the focus group in Watford was just what people said about paying more for climate change. One lady said, I think I pay more than enough in my bills.
If I live on my own and, I've got a 3-bedroom property, I'm on my own, I work, so I'm only there in the evenings, or at the moment there's no gas on anyway, or no heating, but it's extortionate what I'm paying at the moment. And I'm one person, I'm hardly using anything. I do not want to pay the utility bills any more money. Simple as that.
Another man said that he'd thought about getting a heat pump installed rather than a gas boiler, but heat pump's just so expensive, he didn't even consider it. And then there was an amazing moment when everyone was talking about this idea of putting extra taxes on flights. One lady said, we all want to go on holiday, so it's absolutely ridiculous to have this idea that you're going to charge us more.
It's bad enough, isn't it, that we're paying extortionate prices since COVID to go on holiday or to go anywhere. And as you said earlier on, they're talking about building another runway now. They're talking about doing something else in Luton. And yet here we go, we're going back to the green and the environment. So they're saying we need to lower the emissions, but hey, let's build a runway. They're trying to get us to use flights less. Well, we all want to go on holiday, so that's a ridiculous statement. We have to have a car because we need to go anywhere. We can't rely on buses because buses don't take you everywhere. Trains don't take you. It just makes me so angry that they can come out with a statement like that. It's baloney.
And the whole group then suddenly went off onto this rant about how much it cost to go on holiday and how they didn't like the idea of paying any more. I thought the most interesting thing from the 2 focus groups we conducted was we started by saying to them, what are the issues that you're most concerned about in your lives, political issues? People talked about the NHS. A huge number of them talked about the cost of living. Overwhelmingly, this was the biggest issue. And then we said, what about climate change? No one up until that point had mentioned climate change. And we went around the room and people said, I'm concerned about climate change. I think we should do something about it. And there was a kind of social bias that once one person had said they felt that climate change was important, everyone said the same thing.
I don't think we're doing enough. When we've travelled to other countries, I think they're about 20 years ahead of us in terms of renewable energy, recycling, sorts of materials they use for packaging, potato starch instead of plastic. So I think we're quite behind.
I very much try and be green. I've got, like that gentleman there said, I'm very aware of it. I think what concerns me more so is I don't think anything's going to happen in my lifetime, but I worry for my grandchildren and what's going to be left for them.
Everyone said the same thing. But then one of the first groups we did in Watford, one of them broke the consensus. This was a 35-year-old who said, I think there are bigger issues going on in the world at the moment.
I think it's important, but I think there's bigger issues right now going on in the world. There's people starving today. It's probably worth spending money on that than something that might kill you 100, 200, 300 years later.
Once one person had expressed skepticism, it was almost as if everyone else felt they've almost been given permission to be skeptical themselves. And the people who had said that previously, I think climate change is important, when you started digging down, you realized actually it was pretty low on their lists and they were quite skeptical. And certainly on any of the sort of measures that might be needed, they really weren't up for flying less, seeing their energy bills increase.
What annoys me with it is a bit like COVID, where the government said, this is what you've got to do. They sort of did their own thing. And so even with climate change, they're happy to go on their private jets and get where they need to. It's almost like, no, you've got to watch this and that, though. And you think, well, it's almost a little bit hypocritical. So you think, well, if you're doing your thing, it's almost like we'll do ours in a way. Especially like COVID, it's like you've got to stay home and then it comes out there travelling here and there and home. And you just think yourself, it's like, are we the fools?
I would say that there was quite a stark difference in mood between the focus groups in 2021 and the focus groups that we did this year.
And it's so interesting that they seem to acknowledge that this would be a problem for their children or grandchildren. It just wasn't an urgent one for them. Is there also an appeal to the younger part of the electorate on some more of these sort of energy policies?
Yeah, the other interesting thing from the polling is that there is this disparity between people's views based on how old they are. And so, for example, banning the installation of gas boilers in new homes, over 65s, only 23% support that, but 18 to 24s, 40% support it. So you can see there quite a stark age differential between it. And I think that is a factor really throughout the polling. Just for complete transparency, we didn't have any 18 to 19-year-olds. The youngest people in our group, so I would say, were in their mid-20s.
Oliver, you've taken us through some of the really stark differences between 2025 and 2021 in terms of where the public mood is on climate change and the sort of policies needed to combat it. Give us a sense of why you think that might be happening. What's happened in the intervening time to change opinions so drastically?
The first and very obvious thing to say, it's that we're all poorer than we were in 2021. The cost of living crisis, the way in which energy bills are still way, way, way above the levels that they were there as a result primarily of the war in Ukraine. Now you've got a situation where people just think, oh, I don't have the money, I'm barely keeping my head above water. This is a problem for another day. I think that overwhelmingly is the biggest change. Then you have to ask the question, and I admit I don't really have an answer for it, which is, well, that being said, how do you explain the rise in the number of people who are questioning climate change itself? And various people have put it to me that if people are worried about how they'll be able to pay for it, they can justify that to themselves by saying, well, actually, it's probably not too much of a problem in the first place. So there may be a bit of that going on, which explains why people are perhaps more climate skeptic than they were before. And also, yeah, there's small things that people like going on holiday. If they feel that going on holiday is a stretch at the moment financially, the last thing they want is to be told that actually it's going to cost them even more, that could push it beyond the bounds of possibility.
I mean, that makes sense. People will change their views a bit in order to justify their own decisions. Is there something else happening? Are they hearing from the outside world that are telling them that climate change just isn't that much of an issue?
I think that the public discourse around climate change has slightly changed. There's a bit less of a consensus than perhaps there once was. You know, the sort of heady days of COP seem some way away. And in Boris Johnson, you had a prime minister who was a fantastic salesman. And he did passionately believe that the UK needed to do something about climate change. And it was one of the few things that he actually genuinely really did believe. Whereas now, I don't think you have a huge advocate for climate action on the political stage other than Ed Miliband. And he's not the ideal politician you want leading that charge, I would say. Labour are not really themselves passionately making the case for change and for action. So there's not the political leadership that there was around climate 4 years ago. It just really isn't there to the same extent today.
And just in terms of, the shift from those heady days under Boris Johnson where climate was a key issue, I mean, just talk us through the shift in consensus just within the Tory party that sort of followed.
I mean, you have to go back quite a long way because really the Conservative Party's views on climate have always been slightly contested. David Cameron was really the first person to embrace climate as an issue as part of his sort of detoxification of the Conservative brand that successfully led to his election victory in 2010.
But let's just imagine for a moment what we would have to say to our grandchildren if we failed. We'd have to say it was all too difficult. And they would reply, well, what was so difficult? What was it that was so difficult when the Earth was in peril?
That really held throughout the period of the coalition, and some of the sort of key elements of carbon reduction, particularly in terms of the electricity supply, their genesis was in the Conservative Lib Dem coalition. Theresa May largely carried that on.
Well, I believe that we have a moral duty to leave this world in a better condition than what we inherited. And that's why today we're announcing that we will be ending our contribution to climate change by 2050 and legislating for a net zero emissions target.
But if you think back to Liz Truss, she was definitely more climate sceptical than either Theresa May or David Cameron, but she didn't have long enough to put any of her policies into fruition. But I mean, if you remember, she was full up for fracking. And then Rishi Sunak, well, I mean, I think Rishi Sunak was inherently a bit sceptical about climate change.
I'm announcing today that we're going to ease the transition to electric vehicles. You'll still be able to buy petrol and diesel cars and vans until 2035.
I think he was aware that it was a bit of a Pandora's box. There were different views on different sides of the party, and he frankly had bigger fish to fry and sort of put it into the too hard tray.
The proposal that we should force you to have 7 different bins in your home, I've scrapped it. The proposal to make you change your diet and harm British farmers by taxing meat, or to create new taxes to discourage flying or going on holiday, I've scrapped those too. And nor will we ban new oil and gas in the North Sea.
And then since the Conservatives lost the last election, you're seeing this issue re-emerge, and Kemi Badenoch is taking a markedly more sceptical tone around climate change than any of her predecessors, Conservative leaders, have done.
Net zero by 2050 is impossible. I don't say that with pleasure. I want a better future and a better environment for our children, but we have to get real. Anyone who has done any serious analysis knows it cannot be achieved without a significant drop in our living standards, or worse, by bankrupting us.
And you'll see more of that, I think, at the party's conference at the start of October.
We've already heard her saying drill, baby, drill, in terms of how she sort of sees net zero policies, I guess. Just stepping back, looking at the global picture, in the years since 2021, the other thing that's changed, I suppose, is Donald Trump.
That's a big change, and having an openly climate skeptic president and this sort of yo-yoing of American policies towards climate change. Donald Trump pushing for increasing shale gas exploration, trying to bring down the price of oil, reversing many of the policies that Joe Biden brought in terms of subsidies for electric vehicles, new electric technology, new electric renewables. So you've got a big change there. And again, it's a sort of slightly lazy comparison, but, Donald Trump is, for the sort of anti-climate change movement, much what Boris Johnson was to the pro. They're both very good political salesmen. They can both make their argument in terms that the public could understand. And I do think that Trump's re-election has made the sort of global fight against climate change that much harder, because it's easy for other countries to say, well, if America aren't going to do anything, well, frankly, there's not much point, because this is a global effort, and if one of the biggest emitters is not doing this, then what's the point? I think that's a slightly kind of naive view, because China, which again is a huge emitter, but they, I think, do grasp that climate change is a very big issue for their country. And while also building coal power stations at the rate of knots, they're also the absolute leaders in electric battery technology, some types of renewables, solar panels, and they're also rolling out renewable technology at a huge speed and pace as well. So I think, weirdly, climate leadership is more coming from China perhaps than it was from America these days.
That is quite the shift. Oliver, you spend a lot of your time in Westminster, seeing how shifts in public opinion trickle through to policy. What impact do you think this will have on the sort of policies we see across the board in the next year or two?
I think Downing Street will want to keep a very close eye on Ed Miliband's department and will be looking for the early warning signs that Labour's initial commitments on climate change could be an electoral Achilles heel. Starmer himself, I think, is absolutely committed to the net zero agenda. He believes it's important. I think there are others around him in Downing Street who think it's a bit more of a distraction. I think these findings will give the government pause for thought. Another target, which we haven't talked about up until now, this 2030 target, which is basically saying that all Britain's electricity will come from green sources by 2030, which is an amazingly ambitious target. It will cost quite a lot of money, and there's quite a bit of jeopardy for the government in it, because if they don't get it right, it could mean that energy bills go up, and the government has promised that as a result of this, energy bills will fall. Now, with both Kemi Badenoch and Nigel Farage switching, basically breaking the consensus on net zero and climate change, Labour is quite exposed on that front. And if this 2030 target for some reason doesn't pay off, then suddenly climate change, which really hasn't been an electoral issue at all in the years gone by, could suddenly become an electoral issue. They will be worried by the findings that we've seen. And the question is what they do about it. Do they double down and try and make the case of why this is important? Or do they sort of carry on and hope that nobody notices? I think actually they probably need to make the political case again for why it is important for this transition. Otherwise, people will forget about it. And that's where if you've got increasingly sceptical voices, they will come to the fore.
And you're right, we haven't sort of had the political leadership of any big character on the political spectrum banging the drum for the urgency of something to be done for climate change for some years now. Is there a chance they might just change the messaging around some of these policies, show people how it suits their self-interest?
I think that's right. I think the government probably could do more. One is in solar power. The great advantage of solar power is it's not very expensive and actually saves people money off their bills almost instantaneously. Now, I think the government is looking at a scheme which would basically allow households to fit solar panels and start seeing the benefits immediately while paying the upfront costs of installing those panels, which isn't huge, over a number of years. Now, if you can start doing stuff like that, where people can actually see that taking a measure to tackle climate change actually helps their finances, then I can see that being a really positive thing.
We recently spoke to people in 2 focus groups organised by the opinion consultancy Public First to sort of test what the public's views were about climate change and how it had changed and the measures that people thought that should be taken to tackle it. And it was clear that many of them favoured carrot over stick as a way of getting people to change their behaviour.
Incentive is always going to be work for people.
Heat pumps, I believe there was a lot of talk from a couple of years ago, dramatically increased than the normal boiler. You're talking tens of thousands of pounds. So if there's going to be some sort of contribution, then and it's going to save me money in the long run, but also do my bit for the environment, then for me, that's something I'd definitely consider.
And what about the Tories and reform? Will they sort of see polling like this as an opportunity to double down the other way?
Yeah, I think that's right. The slight trickiness is that if you've got 2 parties being quite sort of sceptical on climate, they're effectively competing for that same bunch of voters. Let's go back to David Cameron for a second. The reason why he took the view that he did on committing the Tories to the environmental agenda was because he saw that by doing so, he opened up the party to a wider number of voters who might be prepared to consider it. By sort of changing his brand, he got not just the previous sort of Tory voters, but also people that did feel strongly about the environment. Because it's not just climate change, it's the environment more broadly, and that he made it acceptable to vote Conservative to a wider range of people, whereas arguably sort of Kemi Badenoch and Nigel Farage are competing for a subset of voters, which could be potentially problematic for them.
That was Oliver Wright, policy editor of The Times. And you can find all the results from the polling and more detail on those focus groups online at thetimes.com. The producer today was Shabnam Grewal. The executive producer was Kate Lamble. Sound design and theme composition were by Mal Assetto. Thanks for listening. We'll be back tomorrow.